Who really owned Coyote Pass? Was it Kody? Was it Robyn? Or were Christine, Janelle, and Meri holding pieces of the land all along? For years, fans have argued over ownership documents, mortgages, and half-answers given on camera. But now, after a string of legal filings and testimony, the truth is finally out. And what we've learned changes everything. Because Coyote Pass wasn't just land, it wasn't just real estate in Flagstaff, it was the jewel of Kody's dream. The promised land where his family would all come together after years of splits. He referred to it as the place where each of his wives would have her own piece, where the kids would grow up, and where he would solidify his legacy as the patriarch who constructed a compound for all. But behind the visions, behind the rhetoric, there were papers, legal agreements, subdivisions, mortgages, and those documents revealed a tale that nobody in the Brown family ever spoke about. A tale of loans, unbalanced shares, and signatures excluding individuals who believed they had an interest. So who actually owned Coyote Pass? And why was this truth obscured for so long? As reported by insiders and later confirmed through court-filed documents, Coyote Pass ownership was never split. It was never shared. And the biggest surprise, the property was not even entirely owned by the family to begin with. Let's recall how it started before we entered the smoking gun territory. When the Browns relocated to Flagstaff, the show made it seem like a fresh start. Kody made each wife a promise of having her own lot. Christine, still optimistic then, envisioned building a kitchen spacious enough for family gatherings. Janelle saw herself with a garden and expansive room. Even Meri, though unconvinced, thought that she at least would have her name on some part of the dream. But cracks were observed immediately by fans. Robyn's mansion was bought in full, and the Coyote Pass property remained vacant. Kody talked of subdivision development, yet years passed with not a single poured foundation. Instead, tensions mounted. Christine questioned when construction would begin, to hear vague reasons. Janelle pressed further, asking why the property remained untouched, and Robyn had already established the security of her Flagstaff mansion, her name on titles, and the peace of mind that she wasn't hanging around an empty promise. The reality of what was really behind that deal remained hidden until records came to light outlining just who signed, who paid, and who got left behind. But first, let me ask you, if you've been keeping up with this saga since the start, don't miss what is coming next. This is one of the biggest bombshells in the Sister Wives saga, so if you want the scoop and all the latest as it happens, be sure to subscribe and enable notifications now. Because what I am about to share with you is the paper trail that reveals all: who invested, who dropped out, and how Kody and Robyn acquired much more than they ever conceded. When you strip away the layers of reality television narrative, one thing always stays the same: the paperwork. And in Coyote Pass case, the paperwork says more than Kody's constant speeches or Robyn's tearful interviews. Court documents, property deeds, and mortgage records tell a plain but startling truth. Coyote Pass was never an equal dream. It was never split up the way Kody had promised. And maybe most crucially, not all wives were included as viewers thought. As per confidential records seen in Flagstaff County, Coyote Pass was divided into 4 plots. On paper, it seemed like everyone would find themselves having a piece of it later on. Kody claimed in interviews that the intention was to have fair division, and for each wife to build her dream home, but the money trail tells a different story. Parcel 1, owned jointly by Kody and Robyn. Parcel 2, owned jointly by Kody and Janelle. Parcel 3, initially listed in Kody and Christine's names, but there were complications. Parcel 4, intended for Meri. But here is the catch: the name never showed up on an official deed exactly. The woman who'd been with Kody the longest, the wife who'd spent years being promised things, didn't have a legal claim to the so-called family utopia. More telling, the mortgage on each parcel was not the same. Robyn's plot had a mortgage taken out on both hers and Kody's credit, while Janelle bore significantly more economic risk than anyone understood. Christine, already getting ready to leave psychologically, found her alleged portion tied up with legal entanglements that resulted in nothing concrete. But things get better here. Insiders say Robyn knew all along her name was under protection on official documents, while Meri had been led on with oral assurances. And Christine, she didn't know the truth until her attorney started digging in her process of separation. Imagine believing for years that your sacrifices in money, your dedication to a vision, and your faithfulness to a husband would earn you some land for your children. Only to realize your name wasn't on it at all. That is not merely betrayal. That is legal exclusion that alters the destiny of a family. The files showed a pecking order, Kody and Robyn at the top with secured ownership, Janelle with risk but not much control, Christine mired in controversies, and Meri shut out altogether. And when these became public in court, even the judge commented on the contradictions. He said that the family's public assertions of shared ownership didn't square with what they'd filed. It was the point when the legend of Coyote Pass started to fall apart. The dream did not work for everybody. It was meant to safeguard 2 individuals, and the rest were left hanging. But what if the excluded people rise up? And what if a court puts every detail on the table? If the documents revealed the hard facts, the testimony revealed the sadness. In the courtroom, each wife got her turn to testify, and out came raw, emotional, and sometimes shattering testimony. Christine went first. She was calm at first, but with a seething fire burning within her words. She outlined how she'd believed in Coyote Pass above all else. She recounted the nights she lay awake drawing up floor plans, the time she had to tell her children that someday they'd have an actual house and not just rents or temporary accommodations. She remembered discussing with Kody having a kitchen large enough for family meals, a dream yard in which truly could play, and a plot of land of their own to call home. She stopped, and in the quiet courtroom she confessed, "I only learned through my attorney that my name wasn't even placed on the deed. After all that I had provided, after years of creating this family, I had nothing left." "Do you have any idea how that feels?" Gasps circulated the courtroom. Even the judge had to lean forward, because at that moment it wasn't about forms, it was about betrayal. Then Janelle. Her testimony wasn't tearful like Christine's, it was sharp. Janelle was always the practical one, the budget, managing wife, the long-term sacrificing wife. She spread out receipts, indicating how much she'd put into it. She explained how she paid for property taxes, how she directed her own earnings into keeping pieces of land that she felt she owned in part. Her tone didn't falter, but her words cut so deeply I bore financial risk for years. "I paid taxes, I paid fees, I sacrificed, and yet my real authority over the land was negligible. I believed we were building a future together, but in truth I was financing something that someone else was going to benefit from." The courtroom buzzed. For supporters who had always looked up to Janelle's consistency, her surprise fell like a thunderbolt. And then there was Meri. Her moment was different. She did not bring receipts. She didn't cry in despair. She simply stared Kody in the eye when she said, "I was promised again and again that I would have my peace, that my moment would arrive. I trusted the words, but when the papers were published, my name wasn't included. Not at all. I was removed from the dream that I built from day one." Her deposition wasn't legal. It was personal, because for Meri, being excluded from the deed was emblematic of her whole marriage. She'd been kept on the periphery, always promised a place at the table, only to learn she'd been omitted long ago. By the time they'd finished testifying, the courtroom was no longer an impartial space. The judge, journalists, and even legal observers had the burden of their testimony. This was not just about a piece of property. It was a tale of broken trust, secret choices, and women finding out that they had been pitted against one another. And then Robyn took the stage. The other women's testimonies were about loss. Her testimony was about justification. She attempted to rationalize why her name was safe, why she and Kody made the choices that they did. And instead of sympathy, what was awakened was anger. The judge would quickly label her defense troubling, because if Christine's testimony shattered hearts and Janelle's revealed financial exploitation, Robyn's would show something even more astounding that she knew all along. When it was finally Robyn's turn to take the stand, the courtroom was different. Christine had testified with passion, Janelle with detail, and Meri with subdued devastation. All had revealed betrayal, omission, and sacrifice. But Robyn strode in, head held high, with notes in her hand, prepared to lay out why she felt that her stand was righteous. She started cautiously, her tone low but practiced. "I never intended all this to get so messy. Kody and I made choices together, and everything we did was to safeguard the family. My name was on some deeds, yes, but that was just because of the structure of the loans. It was never intended to lock anyone out. She looked around, obviously expecting her words to ease the blow. But the judge cut her off almost at once. "Mrs. Brown," he stated bluntly, "these deeds don't represent temporary solutions. They represent ownership, and ownership has repercussions. Are you saying that you signed these documents without reading them carefully?" Robyn faltered. She shifted in her seat, her hands tightening on the papers. I understood what they meant at the time, but we always talked about it as if it belonged to all of us. It was always supposed to be shared." The courtroom murmured. That single sentence, "supposed to be shared," made it clear that she knew the legal reality was different. Christine's attorney wasted no time. He leaned in and requested the one question that had been looming over this family for decades. If it was always meant to be shared, why wasn't Meri's name ever put on any deed? Why did Christine have to find out through attorneys that her ownership wasn't guaranteed? Why did Janelle pay taxes without the same safeguards you had? Robyn's face grew red. She stammered, repeating the phrase, "We thought it was temporary," but her answers fell apart quickly. She admitted that she and Kody had prioritized securing their own names because they had the credit history and the bank's trust. In other words, while the other wives were sacrificing financially and emotionally, Robyn and Kody were securing control under the guise of temporary measures. The judge leaned back in his chair and sighed. His words cut. "This court doesn't engage in supposed to, or maybe down the road. Ownership isn't about promises. It is about signatures. And based on what I see here, Mrs. Brown, you and Mr. Brown signed in ways that cut off others who had equal or greater stake." It was a breathtaking moment. The judge wasn't questioning her. He was chastising the whole charade. Fons had long suspected that Robyn's status in the family was not only emotional but monetary. Now, under oath, Robyn verified it. She realized her name was secure on the titles. She realized the others were not. And rather than struggle for fairness, she embraced her privilege. By the end of her testimony, the deed was done. Whatever compassion she had hoped to gain was lost. What she took with her from the courtroom was the impression of a woman who profited from a system that kept the others out. And as the judge began to sift through the financial records, one phrase hung in the balance: who actually owned Coyote Pass? If the testimonies brought betrayal to light, the financial records exposed the machinery of how it occurred. Because at the core of this case wasn't necessarily who signed whom, but who paid whom. When the court finally compelled production of bank statements, loan records, and tax returns, the numbers painted a picture no member of the Brown family could spin. First, the mortgages. The property on Coyote Pass wasn't bought for cash, it was financed. And the monthly premiums were hefty. Kody frequently discussed on camera being under financial pressure, but what he omitted was how those payments were made. Parcel 1, belonging to Kody and Robyn, had the lowest monthly payment for its size. Why? Due to good terms negotiated by using both of their credit histories. Parcel 2, with Janelle, had a much greater burden. She not only appeared as co-owner but also bore taxes and fees that the others never paid. Parcel 3, which Christine assumed she owned, was in a gray middle area. Payments were hit or miss, sometimes from shared accounts, sometimes from Christine herself. That disconnect would be turned against her later, as Kody's lawyers claimed she never fully maintained her share. Then there was Parcel 4, the one Meri was destined to receive. On paper, she owned nothing, but behind the scenes, she did put money toward the down payments, thinking it was a temporary thing until her name was added. That is, she supported land she never actually touched. When Janelle's attorney produced a spreadsheet detailing years of her donations, the courtroom grew silent. The figure was astronomical. Tens of thousands of dollars flowed into mortgage payments, maintenance, and taxes, most of which served parcels over which she had no secure title. The judge scanned the papers and furrowed his brow. "It seems, Mrs. Brown," he said to Janelle, "that you essentially financed property control that shut you out." Janelle nodded gradually, her expression serene, but her voice firm. "That is precisely what occurred." However, the bombshell to end all bombshells came when Christine's lawyers presented proof of a clandestine transfer. Several months prior to Christine's departure from the marriage, Kody had tried to transfer a portion of Parcel 3, her alleged share, into a trust controlled by him and Robyn. The paperwork was put on hold when Christine's leaving sent everything into disarray, but the plan was obvious. Kody and Robyn were taking over control. When this bombshell exploded, Christine couldn't keep quiet. She raised her head in incredulity as her lawyer described the attempted transfer. So while she was being instructed to wait for the dream, the lawyer said, Mr. Brown was actually trying to delete her name from the very dream she was waiting for. The judge's face hardened. His tone was cutting. That is on the border of fraud. And there it was. The instant the courtroom heard the words that fans had been speculating about for years. Fraud. Undefined, not merely poor communication, not merely broken vows. Fraud. The financial documents didn't merely reveal who owned Coyote Pass. Undefined, they revealed how the ownership had been manipulated to gain Kody and Robyn power while sucking the life out of the others. But this was merely the precursor. For what followed, the smoking gun testimony, would leave no question as to whom Coyote Pass was actually intended and why it was secretly constructed for so long. Until now, the case was all about papers, signatures, and money trails. But as explosive as those were, there was still leeway for interpretation. Kody might insist that he'd been misinterpreted. Robyn might insist that she'd only signed what others told her to sign, and the wives might quarrel over who'd believed what. But then came the smoking gun. It turned out to be in the form of emails, actual written communication between Kody Robyn and an actual real estate consultant. These were not casual scribbles. They were elaborate plans, penned months before the family went public about purchasing Coyote Pass. Penning one email in particular brought the courtroom to a standstill. There, Kody described his vision for the land. He talked of long-term consolidation, of putting the titles in the safest hands, and of preventing future conflicts by keeping decision-making centralized. And to whom were those safest hands referring to? Robyn's the advisor responded with unambiguous legal advice. If you aim to consolidate control, you have to be transparent to all concerned. Otherwise, it can be interpreted as concealment or misrepresentation. Kody's reaction, 2 words only: understood, proceed. That one conversation formed the foundation of the fraud allegation because it was intentional, not merely sloppy finances or family conflict, but an intentional effort to take control of the land behind the scenes. Christine's attorney read the email out loud, her voice slicing through the tension. So while Christine, Janelle, and Meri were being informed to invest in their future, Mr. Brown was already mapping out to take decision, making away from them. The effect was instantaneous. Christine sat back, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "I knew it." Janelle gripped her fists, her normally calm face flashing with rage. Meri looked down, shaking her head, as though she'd finally received proof of the betrayal she'd long suspected. But that wasn't the only thing. With the emails were handwritten notes dug up from Kody's personal documents, doodles of ideas for the land. These notes listed plot divisions with initials next to each parcel. Curiously, Christine's and Meri's initials were missing entirely in their place. A large R circled twice. Robyn, the judge, looking over the evidence, didn't mince words. These documents demonstrate premeditated intent to deceive. This isn't poor communication. This is a calculated scheme. That statement sent a ripple through the courtroom. Fans had guessed for years, but here was the proof. Straight from a judge's lips. For Kody and Robyn, the walls were closing in. For Christine, Janelle, and even Meri, vindication came with a bitter taste. They had been correct, but at the expense of their trust, their finances, and years of their lives. And while this proof established who was actually meant to own Coyote Pass, it brought up a much darker issue. Why? What was Kody going to do with land once he had it all? The handwritten letters and emails didn't merely disclose who was supposed to own Coyote Pass. They also alluded to why, and that why stunned even devoted readers of the family. For years, Kody sold Coyote Pass as a fantasy, a large chunk of property in which every wife would have her own home, the children would be raised amidst nature, and the family would finally become whole again. That was the public narrative. But hidden within the files was a quite different vision. One of Kody's handwritten notes, titled Future Plan, had set out a diagram of the ground. But rather than 4 houses, one for each wife, there was only one huge home, dead center. Beside it, written in capital letters, he had put, "Patriarchal Home." This wasn't by chance. The emails with his advisor attested to it. Kody's real plan wasn't to divide the land fairly. It was to build a single grand estate with Robyn and her children as the central occupants. Christine's, Janelle's, and Meri's roles weren't even considered in this version of the future. When Christine saw this plan projected in court, her voice cracked. "So that's it? That was the dream? One house, for him and Robyn, and the rest of us. Just stepping stones to an end." Janelle, the practical one, leaned forward, her head shaking. "I worked for years to pay those mortgages. I gave up my retirement. And it wasn't for a family heritage. It was for their mansion." Even Meri, who had been on the fringes of the marriage for years, was shocked. All this time, he said it was about oneness. But it was about control. About crowning himself a king on property we all invested in. The judge heard intently, then addressed Kody. "Mr. Brown, is that true? Did you plan to homestead this property for one family?" Kody fidgeted, his confidence wavering. His attorney attempted to protest, but the judge insisted. At last, Kody grumbled. It was an idea, nothing more. But the facts were evident. It wasn't an idea. It was a plan, mapped out in ink, backed by secret emails, and financed by money that didn't just belong to him and Robyn. This revelation changed everything. It wasn't just about fraud anymore. It was about betrayal on a fundamental level. The land that was intended to represent unity had been turned into an instrument of separation. And for Christine and Janelle, who had already lost the marriage, the evidence brought closure. But for Meri, who had held on to hope of still being included in the family's future, it was the ultimate devastating blow. But there was one more twist yet to come, because buried within those same documents was a legal provision that nobody, not even Robyn, had fully appreciated. And when it was finally read out in court, it forever altered the question of ownership. By this time, the courtroom had witnessed the financial statements, the emails, the scribbled over plans. It seemed to hang over Kody and Robyn like an albatross. But as the attorneys dug into the small print of Coyote Pass contracts, one forgotten clause reared its head and turned the whole case on its head. It was hidden in the initial purchasing contract, a stipulation most would gloss over, but Janelle's lawyer spelled it out on the projector for all to see. The language was plain but potent. All co-signatories and financial contributors shall have equal interest in proportion to contribution, irrespective of title designation. In simple terms, it didn't matter who his names were on the deeds. What did matter was who contributed financially. Anyone who contributed financially had a legal interest, whether or not their names were on the papers. The room was silent for years. Kody had waved the deeds around as evidence of ownership. But this single clause made the deeds not the last word. The very financial input of Christine, Janelle, and even Meri could confirm their ownership in ways Kody never imagined. Christine gasped. Janelle's lips tightened into a small, relieved smile, and Marianne's, always the outsider, now had legal ground she didn't know she had. The judge glared straight at Kody and Robyn. "Mr. Brown, Mrs. Brown, this provision means that you were not legally entitled to exclude the other wives, even if that was your intent. Every dollar they contributed earned them an interest in this property." Robyn's face turned white. Kody sat back in his chair, his mouth agape, but no sound emerging. Janelle's attorney didn't take long. She unrolled a chart of contributions through the years. Down payments, taxes, mortgage payments, maintenance charges, every dollar was attached to one of the wives. And when the figures were tallied, it was staggering. Janelle had made almost 40% of the overall payments. Christine had paid almost 25%. Even Meri, though locked out on paper, had put in nearly 15% through temporary payments. Kody and Robyn's portion just over 20% combined. In other words, the land Kody and Robyn thought they had secured for themselves legally belonged, by majority, to the very wives they tried to push out. The judge leaned forward, almost incredulous. Based on this clause and the financial evidence presented, the equitable majority ownership of Coyote Pass does not rest with Mr. Brown or Mrs. Brown. It was up to Mrs. Janelle Brown, Mrs. Christine Brown, and Mrs. Meri Brown. The tension that hung afterwards was palpable. Years of wondering, years of family breaks, years of questions gone unanswered. all boiled down to a single revelation: the property Kody insisted was his gem never actually belonged to him. And just as it appeared the case had peaked, the next update made it even more dramatic. Since possession wasn't the only issue on the table, liability was as well. And what the judge decided next would mean who owed, who lost, and who finally got away. Scene Thursday morning, Terrebonne Parish Courthouse, District Judge Tony Marabella's courtroom. The ownership of Coyote Pass no longer hung in the balance. The clause had taken care of that. Christine, Janelle, and even Meri, years of being brusquely set aside, were the rightful majority owners. Ownership, however, was just half the fight. The judge still had to rule on liability. Who was liable for the misrepresentation that had gone on over the years, the attempted transfers, and the financial burden that had been imposed by the secrecy? The lawyers presented their arguments. Christine's attorney contended Kody and Robyn's concealment constituted intentional fraud. Janelle's attorneys pursued the case for financial damages, citing the tens of thousands she had invested in land she almost lost. Meri's counsel demanded recognition that her contributions were not gifts but investments. Kody's defense tried to paint it all as a miscommunication. He claimed the patriarchal home plan was merely an idea that the wives misunderstood, and that his intentions were always for the good of the family. The judge didn't buy it, Mr. Brown, he said firmly. Miscommunication does not explain hidden emails, concealed transfers, or the deliberate centralization of power. The proof is obvious. You and Mrs. Brown behaved in a manner that took ownership away from the rest and benefited you both. The verdict fell in 3 pieces. Restitution: Faye, Kody, and Robyn were instructed to repay Christine, Janelle, and Meri for costs they incurred that disproportionately benefited Kody and Robyn's packages. The figure, more than $1.2 million. Corrected titles: Faye. The titles would be redrawn to show proportional ownership, with Janelle having the biggest stake, followed by Christine and Meri. Kody and Robyn's names would stay, but only symbolic of their actual minority ownership. Economic sanctions: Faye, while the judge refrained from calling it flat-out criminal fraud, he did sanction the concealment, saying to Kody and Robyn that any further efforts to deceive about the property could lead to stricter legal repercussions. As soon as the verdict had been read, the responses spoke volumes. Christine breathed a sigh of relief, tears of joy streaming down her face. Janelle shut her eyes, finally justified after decades of shouldering the economic burden. Meri stood upright, her pride regained, aware her sacrifices were not wasted. Robyn was devastated, muttering to Kody, who gazed numbly at the table, his bluster lost. To viewers viewing this drama, it was the ultimate flip. The patriarch who had once bragged of constructing his legacy on Coyote Pass was now stripped of power, owing it to the very women he'd attempted to cut out. But even as sensational as this ruling was, the tale didn't finish in the courtroom. Because once the dust had settled, each wife was left with a question: what would they do with their new ownership? Would they sell? Would they build? Or would they finally leave the land that had brought them so much sorrow? The ruling had been handed down. Coyote Pass, the site of the symbol of Kody Brown's vision of togetherness and domination, was now legally considered the property majority of the very women he had attempted to sideline. But court decisions are one thing. What follows is another. Christine was first to move. For her, Coyote Pass stood for years of broken promises, lost money, and shattered dreams. She declared that she had no plans to construct anything on the land. She wanted her portion cashed out, turned into money that she could use to invest in her new life, free from the shadow of Kody. Janelle, however, had other ideas. In spite of all the betrayal, she still loved the land itself. She gushed about the beauty of the property, the room for her children, and the freedom that came with it. Coyote Pass wasn't about Kody anymore. It was about taking something back she had given up so much for. To her, Meri was in the middle somewhere. The shock of her money not being down the drain brought her a sense of equity, but similar to Christine, she was reluctant to remain attached to the earth. Years of segregation had made her cautious about investing more in the dream. She threatened to sell her half, but stopped short of a final commitment. And then there was Kody and Robyn. Their patriarchal home vision was destroyed. Not only did they lose control of the majority share, but they now had more than $1 million in restitution to pay. For the first time in years, they were on the defensive, their credibility in tatters not only with the wives, but in the eyes of the court too. The family dynamics, already strained, became well-nigh irreparable. Christine's decision to step back completely left her unrestricted, her backers cheering her newfound liberty. Janelle, although more subdued, earned respect for holding firm and demanding her value. And Meri, who long felt pushed aside, was finally recognized for all she had given up. And Kody, the man who used to boast of creating a legacy on Coyote Pass, his kingdom was in ruins. The property that was meant to forever solidify his patriarchal status revealed him to be a manipulator whose selfishness destroyed all that he had. The truth about Coyote Pass was finally revealed. It was never all about land. It was all about power, trust, and betrayal. And in the end, it was the ultimate symbol of the family's demise, and the wives' long-awaited vindication. So, who actually owned Coyote Pass? Undefined legally, the wives; undefined morally, the ones who gave the most. Undefined and historically, it will be remembered not as Kody's dream, but as the battlefield where the truth finally emerged. Even after the verdict, the reverberations of Coyote Pass still radiated far beyond the courtroom. It wasn't merely about land anymore. It was about the story that had shaped the Brown family for over a decade. For viewers, the reveal corroborated what they had long speculated about in hushed tones. Online communities were aglow with posts, some outraged against Kody and Robyn, others sympathetic to the wives who had suffered so much in vain silence. Podcasts and documentaries unraveled the case, deeming it the fall of a patriarch. Financial advisors commented on how the provision that rescued Christine, Janelle, and Meri was one few families pay attention to. Lawyers hailed the verdict as a milestone case regarding equitable interest. For others, it was a cautionary tale: never buy property without absolute legal safeguards. But for the Browns themselves, the emotional fallout was even greater. Christine's choice to cash out gave her the freedom to truly close that chapter of her life. Janelle's decision to hold her share signaled resilience, a quiet declaration that she wouldn't be erased. Meri's wavering reflected the complicated balance of hope and hurt she carried to the very end. And as for Kody and Robyn, they were forever stigmatized. Nothing that television spin might attempt could erase the court transcripts. The fantasy of being remembered as visionaries who constructed a family compound was lost, replaced by the harsh realities of manipulation, debt, and betrayal. And perhaps the most callous twist: the property they had fought so fiercely for was now in stasis. With several owners, varying visions, and years of legal hindrance, Coyote Pass wasn't going to have a solitary home constructed anytime soon. Instead, it remained an empty field, silent, barren, and laden with the cost of all that it had taken from the Browns. The reality about Coyote Pass wasn't merely finally out. It was immortalized, inscribed into both legal history and the memories of fans who had been watching the family for decades. And in that reality, the world learned not only who owned the land, but who gave their life for it. Coyote Pass started with a promise, an open canvas upon which Kody Brown promised to create a legacy for his wives and children, an open field upon which unity could flourish. Years that dream was teased before the family as both hope and bargaining chip, but ultimately the reality spoke something entirely different. The land was not about togetherness. It was not about creating a future together. It was about control. About one man attempting to solidify his power by putting it in the hands of himself and his beloved wife. And for that desire, he risked the trust, money, and futures of the very women who had worked for him for their entire adult lives. The court battle stripped away the fantasy, the books, the hidden emails, the overlooked clause. They all said the same thing: the wives were the rightful owners, the foundation of the dream, the ones who had paid with their money and their sacrifices. And so, the land that had once been touted as Kody's subsistence became his downfall. Christine walked away free. Janelle recovered her dignity. Meri at last saw her sacrifices confirmed. Robyn, who had once been the focal point of Kody's designs, was left with a besmirched reputation. And Kody himself, once the self-styled patriarch, stood revealed no longer a dream builder, but the architect of their failure. Coyote Pass today remains unspoiled. No patriarchal home, no family compound, no mansions, only open space, a testament to broken promises and unveiled truths. And so, who actually owned Coyote Pass? Not only on paper, but in heart. The reply is simple: it belonged to the women who bore it, financed it, and ultimately revealed its truth. And while the dust settles, one thing is certain: the vision of Coyote Pass was never Kody's to own. It was theirs all along.